Welcome, everybody. This morning, we are going to be looking at human memory, and this is the first of our very last module, Module 6. If you recall, we'll open up with human development the week after Thanksgiving. So today, what we're going to try to do is cover some of the memory slides and get some foundational concepts in there for you so that when you come back the week after Thanksgiving, we can spend some time in class going through and applying some of these ideas and really testing whether or not our understanding of memory really warrants the amount of trust that we place in our memory. So let's start, as we should always, by defining what memory means. And all of us generally have a sense of what we're talking about when we talk about memory, but when we speak of memory, we're usually talking more about the things or the data that we're able to remember or call to mind, if you will, so that we can use them. And we're less aware that memory is a multi-stage process. And so from a psychologist's perspective, we're really defining it not just as the things, the memory data that memory produces. Instead, what we're interested in this segment is to understand how memory is formed. So how does one event get coded to stay in your mind in a way that you can access 2 years from now? And why is it something that you believe is really important, but somehow it doesn't make it through storage and doesn't get retained, so when you need it, you can't find it? So what we're really talking about is both formation as well as the ability to later call upon or retrieve the information in the memory to be able to use it. So calling it to mind, if you will. So this process, the way that we think of memory, has multi-stages or stages of processing. And each one is going to have different features. So we're going to spend some time talking about those because in order for us to understand the whole process, we have to understand that it's the sum of its parts. So we have to understand what those parts are. And there's some really common ways that they differ, but some of the things we'll be talking about include how long they can hold on to memory, how many items of memory or information or memory data they can hold in a moment and over time, and of course, how they work together. And so what we'll find is that there are complementary features in each of these components, and that independently they can't do any of the holistic process of memory, the storage, the formation and creation, and the retrieval. But together, their abilities and their functions allow us to do incredibly complex cognitive processes that get us through life, up to and including behavior and action as well as emotion. As you read your textbook, you're going to find that there's a lot of comparison between a computer or some sort of computer-based digital device and human memory, and it's a very clean and pretty helpful allegory or illusion, really. But one thing that we need to understand is first that just like a computer, we're going to see several parts that all work in partnership. So when we look at memory, we're talking about what we call sensory memory. So this is that sensory raw data that comes in from each of our sensory systems and is received by the brain at the back end of the sensation process. So you can think of sensory memory as just bits of data, not necessarily defined and definitely not perceived. So this is that delivery system where it stops in the brain and pushes whatever data it's collected from each sensory system that's related to the moment into what we call sensory memory or the sensory register. The second part of memory is what we call working memory. This of all three is going to be the most active part of working or of the memory process, because working memory is not just where new information flows in, as it will from sensory memory, but it's also the area where when we think of cognitive processing, if you're working on a math problem and you're trying to remember certain pieces or rules that you have to have or what you did in the past, it's also where we use visual cues, so cognitive representations that are of visual stimuli. It's where we represent auditory experiences, so how something sounded, what the words meant. So it's the most active part, and it's really what we think of as sort of our conscious mind. So when we say later that we'll be calling memories to mind out of long-term storage or out of the storage process. What we mean is working memory is both pulling those out, but it's also the place where we do something with them, if you will. The third part is long-term memory, and long-term memory is data storage, period. Very clean and simple. You can think of this as the storage on your smartphone or your computer or your iPad. You have a limit, and that limit determines how much we can hold at any one point during the memory process. So even amongst sensory memory, working memory, and long-term memory, we're going to see some really diverse levels of time, or what we call duration, which is how long a piece of data can be held in that memory system. But we're also going to talk about capacity, meaning that there are certain types or areas of the information processing system that have limits, so they cannot exceed more than a certain amount. And at times we're going to see variance in how much of a capacity we have due to factors like exhaustion, sleep, food, quality of food intake, all of those things that we've talked about that are essential to daily life. So while these are three parts, remember, they're all part of a larger system. So their differences, which we're going to go into individually in just a second, are important because they complement the others. As we go through this, we'll break down not just what they're doing, but also how they route this information. And what you'll find again is when I say something is active, as in working memory being the most active part, you're going to see that of the three, it is going to be the one that is engaged in the most proactive and has the greatest number of abilities compared to long-term and sensory memory. So let's take a peek at sensory memory. Since we're starting at the beginning, sensory memory is really the first part of the memory process. And I want you to think of sensory memory less like a thing and more of a place. Sensory memory is not just memories of time, it's raw sensory data. And so sensation brings that data to the brain, and it is delivered into the space that we call sensory memory. So we will see different types of sensory data that are distinguishable by the sensory organ that they come from. And the duration is really meaning how long we can retain a certain type of sensory data in our sensory memory or sensory register is going to depend on the nature of the sensory organ. So in other words, where did it come from? Is it coming from the visual system, or is it coming from our auditory system? We distinguish by system of origin, and so our iconic memory, just like you might think of an icon on a computer as a graphic representation of something, or a music or art icon or fashion icon as somebody that we look up to. That idea of looking is a way to kind of remember or anchor this concept of memory. This is going to be visual data that comes in through the visual system, and specifically, it's visual representations that we develop cognitively. So you can think of this as a depiction of what you have seen. These do not hang around very long. In sensory memory, if we do not pay attention to them, and you're going to hear me use this term attend, what I mean is paying attention. If we don't attend to that memory, it's going to be held in the sensory memory of less than a second. When we see echoic memory, echoes, we hear from a distance. Well, echoic memory is auditory data. So this data is going to stick around for a little bit longer, averaging about 3 seconds. And then haptic memory, which is tied to feeling and touch throughout the body, so texture, pressure, things of that nature that we feel through our somato or body senses. These haptic memory is going to have a shelf life in sensory memory of about 2 seconds. So you can see there's some fairly wide variation. On average, it's going to be across all senses less than 1 second to 2 seconds. But just understand that that's an average, which is why you see echoic memory exceeding that by a second. We do have types of memory for both taste and smell. Those are things I'm not holding you accountable for. When we look at these different types of memories, it is really about the type of memory that determines how long it will stick around or how long it endures. Capacity is different here because what the differences in duration across these different sensory memories may suggest to you is that they are all a little bit different in terms of how much space and how much duration they have. So because no singular experience is all or entirely one sensory input, meaning it's always eyes and ears or eyes and touch, or eyes and some secondary effect usually, or sense usually, what we understand is that the capacity varies in sensory memory. It may be higher if we have a large amount of data that stays around longer, so a lot of echoic data. But what we also know is that if we have visual and echoic, and we have haptic, and we have taste and touch, and we've got a multi-sensory input, it means that we are going to be somewhat constrained in our capacity, simply because the characteristics and their endurance and how much space they take up, just like a computer, is not uniform across every piece of sensory memory. So from the process of seeing sensory memory as a stage in the memory formation process, understand that it houses this data, but its ultimate purpose is to move data forward into working memory where it can be processed and we can begin that deep perceptual process. Attended sensory memory, so things that we focus our attention on, will be optimized to move forward in working memory. But I want you to understand this is always and will always be an imperfect process. So at each stage, whether it's sensory memory or where we'll be going next into working memory, what you'll note is that there will always be a certain amount of data that is not attended to sufficiently or is somehow accidentally excluded from what ends up being moved forward. And so as a result, at each stage, there is always going to be data that is lost or what we call forgotten. And if it is forgotten during one of these stages, that particular piece of data cannot be recovered. Long-term memory will operate a bit differently, but for now, think of this loss or this forgetting as being a permanent state of affairs. Short-term memory is another term that you will see used to capture working memory, but I want you to understand that there are some differences in the psychological community as to how we define the two, because what we're really looking at is a blending of two different theories. But we will call it working memory. And working memory, as I've already mentioned, is the most active part of memory. And so that means that any type of conscious processing we're doing, whether it's something we're trying to work out cognitively or having a conversation or walking, all of the things that we physically do are rooted in memory. So our ability to know how to walk today or this second depends upon my ability to access the memory that's located and tied to or powers that this second, just as I did last second. If there's ever a disruption and I cannot remember it, then the physicality or my ability to move can be limited. So, of course, all of this is happening at a very basic sensory level. So we know that working memory will receive data that has been attended to from our sensory memory. And its primary purpose is both reception of that data, active engagement with that data or use, or what we call practice, and then it will encode data that is deemed to be significant enough that we have attended to it sufficiently. And again, the brain is deciding that, we are not. But the data that we encounter the most or the most efficiently or interact with the most efficiently will eventually be encoded, meaning it will transition from working memory to the very last process stage, which is long-term memory, where it's going to be stored. But it's doing all of those two things while it's also simultaneously retrieving information out of long-term memory, so helping us remember. You're on a test, you can't remember a question, but you think back and you call up a picture of what your textbook reading looked like, or you come up with some anchor or cue in the environment that helps you connect to a memory. That's retrieval. It's what we call remembering, but in psychology we refer to it as retrieval. So understand that working memory is happening and doing all of these things that are almost competing in many ways simultaneously and generally doing it quite well. What we see is that for the average person, it's going to have a duration of about 20 seconds, which means that you need to do something with data that enters working memory from sensory memory, or it's gone in roughly 20 seconds. But we believe that that duration is going to vary by a lot of factors, and just as we saw with sensory memory, capacity can also be influenced by duration and the type and nature of the data. But we have a more precise amount estimate for working memory, and generally we say that the capacity ranges from 5 to 9 items on average. And that's something that we refer to as the 7 plus or minus 2 rule. So essentially, just restating it a little bit more succinctly, from 5 to 9 items can be held in working memory at any given time. But because so much is going on, there are multiple sub-elements to working memory. But what we understand is that when we see improvements in memory and we see gains, because memory can be impacted through practice, absolutely 100%, unless we have some sort of cognitive or neurological issue. What we know is that the more that we're able to process, so the greater that capacity, the longer that we can hold things in memory. And again, just remember these are microseconds and micro items, so it isn't something that is long term. It has to be less than 20 seconds. The more we can do with working memory, typically we see a very high correlation with high intelligence and expertise or knowledge, which suggests that our memory improves the more practice it receives, particularly in certain areas where we have extensive knowledge, and of course when it comes to activities and abilities that are associated with intelligence. What we see working memory do in addition to all of its tasks, or maybe I've already said this and we need to speak about it as one of its tasks, is it will encode the data that moves forward into long-term memory. What we have in working memory is a temporary store. It is never intended to house or be the place that we come back to remember things from. So instead, it is where we bring information from memory out to so we can operate or do something with it. So on the front end, the encoding or that movement into storage happens here. And again, what we attend to most does move forward. And where it's going to move is into our long-term stores, which will become the place from which we retrieve. But let's just take a minute to look at a couple other facets of working memory before we head into long-term, because there's some interesting things that we can very quickly learn about strategies and also tendencies that we see with working memory that we can exploit or use in strategic ways to improve our capacity. So what you see here are some memory strategies that specifically apply to working memory. So when we need to remember something on a short-term basis, maybe you need to run to the store and you have 3 items that your roommate says, hey, will you add these 3 items to the list when you go and grab them? Sure, but you don't feel like writing them down. Well, there's some things that we can remember, or some ways in which we can remember that data that can make us more efficient and positively affect what capacity or duration we have for working memory. So let's look at some of these. The first is something we call chunking, and chunking just essentially means breaking down a large piece of data into its smaller components. And we do this sort of naturally. If we have a list of items that we need to, say, get from the grocery store, and perhaps there are 12 to 15 items that include things for a dinner meal that I'm preparing, and one for my daughter's lunch, and one that is for desserts or snacks. If I begin to think instead of the long list of 27 items, but I begin to instead go, okay, my daughter has essentially the same lunch every day. So if I remember daughter's lunch, I don't have to remember all of the pieces. By putting all of the details of what goes into a sandwich and chips and fruit and all the normal things that she takes to school, I can simply conceptually commit it to memory and link it. And so what I'm doing is taking those items and linking them to something that I already know, specifically what my daughter takes to lunch. So when I get to the store, I don't have to pull up lunch, bread, meat, cheese, etc. Instead, I think daughter's lunch. And then I can use the memory stores that already exist to populate that list, get what I need, and get out of the store with all the same items. We do this a lot in academia. If you've ever seen sort of content segments in a course where instead of teaching you, say, all of behaviorism, we break it out and teach it across multiple domains in psychology. And so the idea is you don't have to remember every rule about psychology's behaviorist movement, but when you encounter something that has some pertinence or relevance, you can always dip back into that. This can be something that we do naturally. It can also be something that we can strategically leverage. So you'll see that with chunking, this could be something that you use with your friend who's hollered out the things that they need you to pick up from the store. So if they need Doritos, beer, and Lunchables, then you can kind of divide that into lunch and then party needs. And hopefully, if you can remember those items, then you know exactly what it is that you're going to get at the store without having to write it down and without having to depend heavily on a list. But most of the time, we don't by default use chunking because we don't often have enough of a root or basic memories that are pertaining to what we need to be able to organize it in this way. And so the most common approach is something we refer to as maintenance rehearsal. And this is where you repeat information that you need to remember over and over again. This may be aloud, so verbally restating them repeatedly, or it could be something that you just replay in your mind. If you're saying it aloud, then you're also activating your auditory system as well as your language production centers in the brain. So in theory, this should work really well. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that reliably. The parts that do work, if it's really simple, yes, this may help you force working memory to encode the data that you need to remember into long-term memory over time. But to give you an example of where I see this a lot when I give tests in the classroom, I'll often approach the classroom and see a student there studying avidly. And while they're studying, I see them read and then they look up and often close their eyes and repeat what it is they're trying to remember for the test. And this usually almost always happens before an assessment. So what is happening there is maintenance rehearsal. We're trying to repeat it enough that it sticks and encodes to long-term memory. So in 15, 20 minutes when we go in and take the test, we can get to it. But the problem is that with maintenance rehearsal, what we're really effectively doing is reintroducing the data we need to remember into working memory. So sensory memory pushes it forward, we repeat it, and every time we repeat, it's as if it gets reactivated in working memory. But time, as well as other distractions that come into play, are often going to derail our repetition. And so often we will find ourselves remembering one or two things, or maybe only partial information. Also kind of related to this is something we refer to as the serial position curve. You'll sometimes see it listed as the serial position effect, but this is just a rule of thumb about items that appear in sequence or in a list. And there are two factors we need to know. When items appear in a list, we are far more likely to remember two collections or groups of those items and far less likely to remember a third. We refer to our tendency to remember the very first few items in a list to be the primacy effect. So they were the first sensory data related to this that we encountered, therefore it hits working memory and it's going to have a bigger impact than the items that follow. But the second most likely to be remembered is what we refer to as the recency, or the most recent data that we've heard, so it collects at the end of this sequence. And this difference is due to transitions. So we have both the introduction, which is high impact of the list, and then on the back end, we will have sort of this ending or termination of the data, which is also a significant point and reinforces attention. What gets lost is the data in the middle. And so if we know this, then we can begin to kind of think strategically. If I need to remember something and I have found that maybe there are 5 terms and I've struggled to remember the second and third, then I need to mix up the way in which I am studying those. And I need to replace those with the first and the last, or make them the first and the last. Why? Because I'm going to have a better chance of remembering them. Moreover, it also is going to tell me which items I'm most likely to lose. So if there is some reason why I can make a note of some but not all items and still have it work, catching those that fall into the middle of the sequence or the list is going to be much more effective. First and the last ones tend to stick with us. This also has important implications when we want somebody to remember information that we're telling them. So in terms of PR communications models, this is particularly important because we are going to sequence and place items into lists based upon the impact that we want them to have, because they will impact and be remembered based upon their chronology. When information moves forward into long-term memory, all that is doing is being stored. And so think of our long-term memory as your hard drive or even your cloud storage that's tied to your mobile devices. And what makes this unique compared to the other memory stores that we've talked about are the fact that we believe this is lifelong, and we do not have a prescribed duration. We also believe its capacity to be limitless, meaning there isn't a certain amount of data like you have on your phone where suddenly you have to begin deleting apps or videos or whatever. The problem, of course, is we can't ever truly say that it is either one of these things, because scientifically there's no method that we're able to objectively test that. You can't disprove something that has no termination. So while these are presumptions, please understand that this doesn't preclude things such as dementia or other forms of neurological or psychiatric disorders that impact memory. This would be in a healthy individual with no specific impact due to illness or injury. We know that data flowing that is becoming or flowing from working memory that is encoded into long-term is really flowing directly through the structure of the hippocampus that is found in the brain as part of the limbic system. So we're going to see that there are multiple types of memory. You'll see those on the right side of our slide here. And the hippocampus is responsible for one of those, which is what we call explicit memory. And so explicit memory, which are memories that are language-based and things that I can, because they're language-based, convey to you in words. These are going to include things that are what we call episodic. So the events or situations that have happened in your life, things you have experienced, and semantic, which are going to be meaningful facts and events, things that are rooted in reality. So what I mean by that is not something that I've made up. This could be trivia, the capital of a certain city or country. It could be knowledge that I have acquired about how processes run or specifically about operational models. But these are things that I can always convey. So I can tell you about, say, the first time I ever gave a public speech, or I can tell you the first time that I had my first kiss or my third birthday. All of these are episodic, but these are things I can easily access. I know they're there. Semantic, this is usually information about the world. So facts, things that are objective or at least semi-objective in terms of our ability to validate them. We also are going to have a second subtype of memory next to explicit that varies in two ways. The main way is that it is not going to be a language-based memory. This means that we don't have the ability to explain how we do things. Implicit memory is memory that is linked to behavioral movement. So you'll think of things aligned with like muscle movement and other types of things that come about through practice and repetition of certain physical skills. Now, what we know about implicit memory that sets it apart, aside from this language-based difference, is that it is something that is going to be linked to doing something, an action. And so we refer to one of the subtypes here as procedural memory, which, if you think about this as learning to ride a bike or learning to walk, learning to brush your teeth even, there are certain aspects that, yes, I can tell you generally that one leg goes before the other, but with implicit memory, the reason that you know that I possess a certain type of implicit memory or a certain implicit memory data set is the fact that you can see me engaging in the behavior. And it isn't because I can tell you how to do it like I can with explicit. It is because you can see me doing it. And what's important to understand is these are very much separate and distinct subsystems within long-term memory. And when I say separate, I mean fully separate. These two do not interact in the way that you might expect. And the reason that we're so certain of this is because of some of the data that has come from patients who have experienced different types of memory loss that are not specifically related to a type of psychological disorder or a situation in which there is a trauma, both internal or external trauma to the brain or the nervous system. Let's take just a quick minute and look at some strategies that can impact memory improvements. And we've talked about the idea that practice does help. Well, there are some very coded ways that we can improve not just in academics, but in really different aspects of our life. And what it requires us to do is think a little bit differently. You're going to see that there's some elaboration that is going to connect back to rehearsal, which we saw just a moment ago. We talked about maintenance rehearsal and that repetition of trying to encode and push data through working memory repetitively in hopes that it will make it to long-term storage so we can get back to it or retrieve it later. Elaboration is similar to that, but the difference is that it is a form of rehearsal, but what we're doing here is not repetition. What we're doing here is engaging with new ideas and making connections to things we already know. And so this will include things that have direct application and things that may seem a little outlandish. So if you think of things like PEMDAS, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. The order of operations is fundamentally an acronym, but the reason that we call it elaboration is you've got this statement, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, that you learn and memorize, brand new, and what you do is connect it to the elements of mathematical operations that you have already learned. So, parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, and subtraction. So the idea behind elaborative rehearsal is that I'm going to connect new thing to something I already know. So over time and repetition, today when I ask you what, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, means, or even what the acronym PEMDAS means, some of you will have enough of an ability in memory to go in, retrieve PEMDAS, and then you'll start going through the letters. Some of you can just recite it. But what's happening is you're pulling that extra data, so what each letter stands for, into memory based upon a trigger or a cue of just this acronym or this saying, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. Elaborative rehearsal works much better compared to maintenance rehearsal, and it is far more effective. Semantic networks means connecting different meanings and sort of indications or relationships, if you will. And if you have ever done a mind map or a conceptual map, this is a semantic network. And what you map is how you understand all of the parts of whatever it is that you're trying to understand or study. And so you see what you see on the left. Mind mapping is sort of a part of this. You come out with a concept, perhaps it is long-term memory, and then in one blurb you say everything you know about it, and then you connect that to working memory and say everything you know about it. It's externalizing how it is we understand something and sort of making connections on paper. And by doing this helps us to be able to better understand what we know and how we know it and what it connects to. And both of these introduce a level of what we call depth of processing that exceeds anything maintenance rehearsal can do. Depth of processing means we're engaging with each idea, each piece of an idea deeply. We are taking a different perspective and trying to change the way in which we interact with it or understand it, or even improve our own understanding of our understanding, if you will. Both of these can be really effective because they tend to produce long-term retention and long-term learning successes. The other two I want to talk about just briefly. Schemas are a mental framework, and they're something that was originally proposed by Dr. Piaget. It was a developmentalist, and it was a way of sort of understanding the connections and the way that we organize data cognitively. And essentially, you can think about how we categorize things. So if you think of the word animal, I'm sure that animal is going to include pig, it's going to include dog, it's going to include rat, it's going to include snake. Now, we can further subdivide those, and the more that we learn about animals, the more increasingly complex these schemas become. But initially, animals are really simple. When we're young, the schema animal is usually going to be something we develop in, say, the ages 2 to 3 range after we've already had some interactions with individual animals. Maybe we have a dog, and maybe we have a cat, and maybe we have a squirrel that roams around the house outside, and those are kind of our framework. Eventually, we learn that those have common features that put them under this sort of umbrella of animal. And as we encounter new animals that vary but share some characteristics, we put them in to our schema of animals, or we break them out and create a new schema. So understanding how we understand, again, similar to semantic and concept mapping, can help us to be able to connect ideas to new learning and also help us be able to be more effective in terms of understanding theory. Encoding specificity really refers to all of the environmental inputs that surrounded us when we learn the information. And what this means is that environment, sounds, any kind of sensory data can serve as what we call a context cue. And a cue is just something in the environment that triggers or brings up a memory when it is that we encounter whatever this cue is. And sometimes we know what those are and sometimes we don't. But one of the things that is important if you're going into, say, a testing environment, you don't want to study in a really loud, kind of chaotic environment unless that's the environment where you're taking your test. And consistency across those two environments, from the learning to the actual retrieval, means that the more consistent they are, typically the better the retrieval will be. So if you are testing in a quiet environment, you really want to study in a quiet environment. And the reason for that is not because it'll help you remember everything, but it does mean that there may be some data that you are less likely to remember in an environment that differs. And the reason why is there's something conceptually or perceptually, whether you are fully aware of it or not, that is linked to or connected to some piece of data. If you've ever had the experience of trying to recall something while you were testing and actually physically recalling the physical environment or where a professor stood when they talked about a certain topic, or even the layout or graphic on a PowerPoint, what you're doing in that moment is really trying to falsely elicit encoding specificity. What were the environmental cues that surrounded the data that you need to know? Memory failures are absolutely inevitable. We cannot assume, nor are they ever, things that are less common. In fact, these are things that happen all the time. And the problem, of course, with a memory failure is that they aren't always evident to us, even if we're the one who has committed the failure, if you will. So let's talk just a second about forgetting, because we tend to associate forgetting with being the memory failure. The idea being that if I can't retrieve it, then I have forgotten this information. But you've already heard me say a couple of times that we see loss of data in sensory memory, we see it in the working memory, and we also see it in the long-term memory to some extent, although it's much more reduced. There is no such thing as a perfect memory system, so forgetting is inevitable. And forgetting was really first proposed conceptually by Ebbinghaus and in 1885, where he talked about less so about the mechanics of forgetting and more about what we can expect from forgetting and sort of how the mind generally works. And what he found was that for most individuals, there is a rapid and immediate loss of detailed memory on things that we've learned, and this happens as soon as the learning experience is over. He found that it would generally stabilize in terms of loss about 30 days after the learning experience. And what he's found is that this shows up fairly consistently no matter what the domain or loss is. And what it tells us is that repetitive learning practice, again, which would reintroduce the data over and over again, will change and alter learning, meaning it will keep us up and allow our knowledge to grow as opposed to large data losses. And the problem, of course, is this doesn't tell us what forgetting is, and that may seem like a strange question, but memories are forgotten in many different ways. There is no uniform way that we lose information. So let's look at a few of these that kind of explain what Ebbinghaus found or the patterns of data retention. So the first is something that we call an encoding failure. And we talked about encoding being the process in which attended data is moved from working into long-term memory. So an encoding failure means the data that we thought should be moved to long-term memory where it will be stored is not moved forward. So it stays in working memory and eventually degrades and is lost sometime in 20 seconds after it is no longer acted upon. And how that encoding failure happens varies. We can't account for each one. But in this case, we say forgetting occurs because the memory was never was never actually stored. And in effect, it wasn't encoded, therefore it never made it to long-term memory. We thought it did and tried to very often through different types of rehearsals, but we lost it somewhere when it deteriorated through our working memory. But we can also experience something that we call memory decay. And this is very similar to, this would apply to long-term memory, but this is probably the closest example or definition or theory that is going to align with most of the way that we think about forgetting. The idea here is that over time, with disuse, with lack of practice and lack of engagement, memories degrade, but they don't just disappear all at once. If you ever saw that movie, either one of the Inside Out movies, they had depicted memory as sort of existing in these bubbles that when they were finally forgotten would go into a pit and they would just degrade and fall to dust. And that's similar to what we're thinking about here. We don't lose a memory whole hog, we lose it in pieces. And so that means that this decay is gradual, it's often unpredictable. So it isn't first piece into memory is the last piece retained, nor vice versa. It just happens over time. And so sometimes we can recall pieces of data, but we recognize that there's pieces missing. In that case, we're probably looking at a case of memory decay. But we also have two forms of forgetting that we define as interference, in which the data that we need to remember or retrieve from long-term memory is in fact present, but we're unable to either get to it, to retrieve it, because there's something that's blocking our ability to retrieve. And these are experiences that we often are aware of because they're frustrating and we know that we know what it is we're looking for. It's sitting there. You'll often hear people refer to this as the tip of the tongue phenomenon. So with retroactive interference, what we see is that new information that we're taking in that could be directly related or only tangentially related interferes with our ability to call up or to retrieve older memories from long-term memory. And if we can't pull them out of long-term memory, we can't bring them into working memory. And so often we'll try to recall very intentionally, it won't come up, but we have this other memory that we know is not relevant and helpful, but it sticks with us. And so it blocks it. We see the inverse of this same model with proactive interference. Here, the only difference is that older memories interfere with us retrieving memories that are new. So instead of retrieving something we've learned or have sort of adopted much later, we tend to go back to the old memory or the old knowledge point. And in both of these cases, these are considered temporary. Memory decay is not. Memory decay and encoding failure are permanent. These mean that that data cannot be regained. Whereas with retroactive and proactive interference, we see something very different where this is going to be temporary and often you will regain access to that memory data. You haven't lost it, it's just temporarily being blocked. When we look at memory failures, we have to understand that memory is impacted not just by changes or alterations that are physiological, but we also can understand memory failures and many have helped us to be able to better understand memory itself. So looking at different disorders and as well as some distortions that are fairly common, let's start with our disorders. We have two forms of amnesia here, retrograde and anterograde. And I mentioned when we talked just a couple of slides ago about how we understand implicit and implicit memory to be two very separate, distinct, and different processes in long-term memory. It's really our work with antero and retrograde amnesic patients that have helped us understand that. So with anterograde, this means that I have retained all of the memories from my past, but what I am unable to do is I am not able to create new long-term memories. So folks with anterograde will be able to go in and ride a bike from childhood. They'll be able to, feed themselves after a traumatic brain injury. They'll be able to do all of these things that they already knew. But if you try to teach them something new, they cannot take it in. And so this includes sort of time frames where you will see very predictable windows. People with anterograde often will say have a 5 to 20-minute reset. And so they take in information and they can maintain that data in working memory for a while because they're engaging with it. But the moment that that stops, that data does not get encoded to long term. So that means it's not retained. And that whole event, all the learning and it happened during it, is lost to the individual. And in essence, their memory resets, retaining all of the older data. There's a classic case of HM that your book goes into who experienced this very phenomenon after his hippocampus was removed. And it's helped us to understand in terms of how these memory systems work, because anterograde amnesia really creates this sort of marker in the road from the point of the incident or the event. From that point forward, our capacity for memory is compromised, so new memories don't happen. But when we look at retrograde amnesia, we have something really different. With retrograde amnesia, I can't remember the past, but I can form new memories. And this means that it's still going to be a memory failure. It's just in an opposite direction. So I'm not going to be able to tell you who I am. I am not going to be able to tell you a lot of what my childhood was like, where I grew up, any of that data, but I will be able to form new memories. So in contrast to our anterograde, our retrograde has lost the past, but they can form new. So they have the capacity to build forward. Now, one thing that's important to note with our retrograde amnesia is this has been one of our greatest teachers. Even individuals who cannot tell you where they are from, those who cannot tell you what their address was, who their parents are, or even sometimes their name, things that we would associate with episodic and specifically semantic memory, or what we call explicit memory, language-based. Those things are lost. But what isn't lost is that if you give someone who has retrograde amnesia, who's say 54, a bicycle, you haven't taught them how to ride, they can't tell you where they grew up, but what will happen is they will hop on the bike, and if they knew how to as a child and learned, that memory will still be retained. They'll hop on and be able to ride just like they did in childhood. What that tells us, the significance of that, is that implicit memory, so that memory for riding a bike, that memory for being able to do all sorts of different things that are procedural, things that are not semantic, not language-based, like episodic or semantic, but things that are not language-based are retained. So the damage or the trauma that's undergone by the structures that create explicit memory are harmed, but those that are linked to implicit memory are retained, which tells us that they are two entirely separate systems that operate autonomously. Alzheimer's disease is one form of dementia, and it's one that most are familiar with, but there are many forms of dementia, and every one works and operates in different parts of the brain and in different ways. But with Alzheimer's disease, we see a loss of memory that's specifically operating in terms of neurotransmitter levels, specifically acetylcholine. But we also see some structural differences. Folks with Alzheimer's tend to have a hippocampus that's much smaller in size. And as we talked about a moment ago, we know that the hippocampus is really critical for that creation or that formation of new episodic memories and semantic memories. So that suggests that there is some sort of limitation or restriction with the smaller size, a difference in structure that may make people more likely to develop Alzheimer's at some point. Again, this is hypothetical and based upon empirical research, but at this point there is no direct or causal connection identified. And the last thing I want to talk about is the misinformation effect. And this is something that I believe we discussed in passing with regard to Elizabeth Loftus, a psychologist out of UC Davis who specializes in understanding how false memories and misinformation become integrated into real or true memories. And we talked about the idea of phrasing of questions and interrogations and how the words or the descriptors that we use can influence the results that we get, even in a research setting or an interview setting. So what we need to understand and how that happens is that there are many different mechanisms by which memories become corrupt. And when we have gaps in memory, we often will try to make sense of what may have happened. And you'll find this sort of co-constructing when people do it aloud. They talk to somebody who was also there at that time and they go, oh no, it was, you don't remember that. That's what happened. This happened. And they'll insert that information. So what we know is that we do this on our own, and it's never something that we're doing in a manipulative way. It's usually because we want to understand, and we're trying to make sense of that, of the gaps. But they can be extremely dangerous because when data is inserted into new memories, even once, even not allowed, but just internally, that data tends to retain. And so it alters the state of that memory. And the more we recall a memory, so the more often we have to call it to mind, every time it is called to mind, we run the risk of memory corruption. So the more often we remember something, the more likely we are to corrupt it and to add data to it. And so there are many structures within our criminal justice system, as well as other entities that involve data collection and sort of getting information from humans, that are predicated on this belief that memory doesn't change. But in reality, it's highly, highly malleable. So when we come in next week, we will spend a little bit of time in a class activity looking at some of these memory disorders and distortions. So be sure you refresh on these right before you come into class next week. The last memory failure I want to talk about comes at us from a very different perspective than I would say some of the others. Most of what we've talked about focused on memory loss or the introduction of sort of false memory to cover memory gaps. But we also have to understand that memory failures can come or can take the form of being unable to get rid of or unable to forget. And we have flashbulb memories, which are a form of memory that we tend to associate with PTSD, but understand it can be associated with other disorders, with trauma that is not PTSD, does not produce PTSD, and even in cases where individuals are experiencing non-psychiatric situations. So the key here is that these are going to center around something that's extremely emotionally volatile. So there's going to be a high degree of trauma, there's going to be a high degree of emotional or usually fear, but not always. And what we're going to find is that these memories, sort of separate from all of the ones that surround them, get encoded and transferred to long-term memory, but because they're traumatic and sort of spicy, if you will, there's some form of disruption in the way that they get encoded. So the encoding itself is flawed, it's imprecise, it's non-specific. And so there may be things missing, there may be large gaps, or it may only be restrained to or limited to one or two sensory inputs and ignore some of the others. The problem is that these are going to appear so vivid and so real for the person that it can be difficult to distinguish between what's real and what's not. These come on quickly, they're intrusive, and similar to intrusive thoughts, they often tend to be persistent, meaning they're going to come up again and again. That doesn't mean they always will, but people can have one-time experiences in which that occurs. But for most people, particularly the larger the trauma, the more significant the event, the more likely these are going to come back. And when they become persistent, because they are so vivid and they're so powerful and so tightly linked to sensory data that we know intimately that's around that trauma and that memory, it makes it almost impossible for us to let them go. And of course, the more we think about trying to forget something, the more likely we are to remember it. So it's important as we close out this segment to just understand that memory failures are not always about forgetting. We can have persistent memories that haunt us in many ways. And often the memories, whether they're linked to PTSD or not, these are enough to feel destabilizing and to produce an emotional response. In more extreme cases, individuals will try to avoid them. Unfortunately, we can't hide from memory. We can disempower it, and we can make flashbulb memories gradually lessen by sort of taking control. Therapy is really effective for this in dealing with trauma and in helping individuals find a way to disempower these in terms of frequency as well as impact emotionally. And the long-term effect is to improve quality of life.